Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about what it meant to face trial in the Middle Ages, a time when Roman law had collapsed and justice was shaped by custom, the church, and the weight of community memory. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honor, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. I still remember the silence that followed the fall of Rome, not the silence of peace, but of uncertainty. The great codes and scrolls that once guided courts across the empire were scattered, their authority fading with the legions that no longer marched. What remained was not a single order of law, but countless fragments, woven together by the memories of elders and the strength of custom. Where once the 12 tables had spoken, now the voices of tribes carried judgment. The air of finality in those days was heavy, as though justice itself had become fragile. Among the Franks, justice lived in the Salic law, a code that mixed Roman precision with tribal instinct. Each vergiled payment, each punishment written, carried the rhythm of a people learning to govern themselves without imperial shadow. Yet the words were not carved into stone for all to see. They were carried in memory, in the cadence of tradition repeated at village gatherings. I recall seeing men recite these laws aloud, their voices trembling under the weight of remembering, for forgetting a line could alter the course of someone's life. Law was as much song as it was decree. The Visigoths, too, sought their own way. Their laws blended Roman structure with Gothic spirit, striving to anchor society after centuries of turbulence. The Codex Eurasianus, I heard it called, was one of the earliest attempts to keep justice steady in a shifting world. But parchment was scarce, and understanding rarer still. In practice, the law remained a living thing, carried in the hands and tongues of local lords. It bound no one beyond the reach of their power. Justice bent easily, for it belonged to those who enforced it. The Lombards brought their edicts southward, and their law also fused with what Rome left behind. They carried with them the deep sense that the tribe's memory was enough to settle disputes. It was said that an assembly of free men could weigh the guilt of one of their own, and no higher authority was required. The simplicity of their justice was both its strength and weakness. In their courts, blood could be balanced with silver, and honor was restored not through Roman judgment, but through negotiated peace. It felt raw, but it was real. Everywhere I walked, I saw the land itself shaping law. In one valley, a theft might be punished with fines, while beyond the hills, it could mean death or mutilation. There was no longer a single empire to unify the scales of justice. Each tribe weighed guilt differently. It taught me that justice in those times was not universal, but local, as rooted in soil and memory as the crops that fed the people. Each settlement became its own world, with rules as distinct as its dialects. Justice was not abstract, it was intimate and personal. The role of elders in those days cannot be forgotten. They were the keepers of memory, the walking archives of law. A grey-haired man or woman could carry greater authority than a written code, for their word was backed by decades of living within the customs. When disputes rose, eyes turned not to scrolls, but to their wisdom. I recall their voices, calm, deliberate, yet fragile, for one misstep could sow discord. Their role revealed both the beauty and the danger of a justice system rooted in oral tradition. Even in decline, Rome's ghost lingered. Some customs borrowed her clarity. The use of fines, contracts, and even property rights echoed her law. But stripped of imperial strength, these echoes became scattered notes in a song no longer sung in harmony. Instead of one grand choir, there were countless smaller voices, rising and falling with the needs of each people. To face trial in those days was to step into a theatre of uncertainty, where outcomes depended more on memory and standing than on universal law. I walked through villages where justice felt as fragile as parchment left in the rain. Some found solace in its flexibility, believing it closer to the will of their people. Others longed for the order that had vanished with the eagle standards of Rome. And so the Middle Ages began with law as a patchwork, stitched together by survival. To face trial then was to enter a world where justice was not written in stone, but in the breath of men, shifting as quickly as the wind across the fields. When Rome's law crumbled, another voice rose to fill the void. The voice of the Church. Its bishops and abbots carried authority not only over souls, but over disputes that touched daily life. Marriage, inheritance, and even the sins whispered in confession could be judged within ecclesiastical courts. To many, this seemed natural, for who else could interpret God's will but those who spoke His words? Justice was bound to morality, and morality was defined by canon law, which shaped the conscience of Europe like a steady hand on clay. I remember the fear of excommunication as sharper than the edge of any sword. To be cast out from the church was to be severed from the sacraments, from burial in consecrated ground, from the very promise of salvation. Such punishment extended beyond the individual. Neighbours turned cold, trade ceased, and one's very name became shadowed. Few dared defy it, for the church held not only the authority of men, but the eternal weight of heaven and hell. Trials under her eye carried a gravity beyond earthly judgment. Unlike the village courts that spoke with the uncertain tongue of memory, the clergy wrote their words. Their Latin, inked into manuscripts, preserved decisions in a permanence rare for the time. This gave the church a sharp advantage, for written law outlasted the voices of men. When bishops read from these texts, it felt as though time itself stood as witness. Their record-keeping gave their courts a consistency that secular gatherings often lacked, binding justice to parchment as well as prayer. I recall how disputes over land frequently came before abbots, for monasteries were not only houses of prayer, but powerful landlords. Their wealth in fields and vineyards demanded constant defense. Clergy judged with an air of solemnity, their eyes lowered, their words heavy with scripture. To them, justice was not about vengeance but correction, not about balance alone, but salvation. A thief might repay his debt, yet he was also instructed to confess, fast, and pray. Justice was meant to heal both body and soul. Yet the church's authority was not without contest. Kings and lords bristled when their subjects fled to sanctuary within church walls, claiming protection from secular law. Priests argued that God's house was inviolable, that no soldier could drag a fugitive from its altar. This tension shaped many trials, where the accused sought holy ground to shield them from worldly hands. The struggle between throne and altar was not merely political. It decided who could truly claim the right to judge. Clerical courts did not judge all men equally. The benefit of clergy allowed those who could read Latin, often priests, but sometimes even literate laymen, to escape harsher secular justice. They were tried in ecclesiastical courts, where punishments were lighter and death sentences rare. I watched resentment grow in the eyes of peasants who had no such recourse. Justice, in truth, was uneven, tilted in favour of those who wore the tonsure or held the pen. The church's mercy, though real, was not equally given. The canon law itself deepened with time, especially after Gratian's decretum in the 12th century. This great compilation organised centuries of scattered rulings into a coherent body, guiding countless courts. Its influence was immense, shaping not only trials of priests, but even inspiring secular judges to adopt similar procedures. Cross-examination, appeals, and written testimony. These found their roots in canon practice. Through the Church, the Middle Ages rediscovered a sense of structure that Rome once carried. As the fire of my memory burns low, I cannot forget how the Church bound justice to eternity. To face her courts was to face both man and God, to stand before judgment that sought to cleanse as much as to punish. The balance of this power was fragile, contested by kings, resented by commoners, yet unshakable for centuries. In that fusion of prayer and law, the medieval world found both comfort and fear, for in every sentence echoed the promise of salvation or the dread of damnation. There were days when justice was not sought in parchment or in the wisdom of men, but in the hand of God alone. I watched with heavy heart as accused souls were led to the ordeal, their fate resting not on argument or evidence, but on a divine sign revealed through fire or water. To the people of those centuries, there was no higher judge than the Almighty, and so the test was set to let him reveal the truth. Fear hung in the air like incense, for no man could predict how God's will would unfold. The ordeal of hot iron was among the most dreaded. A glowing bar, drawn from the flames, was placed in the hands of the accused, who walked 3 measured steps before dropping it. Their wounds were then bound and left to heal. If the flesh mended cleanly, innocence was declared. If infection spread, guilt was confirmed. I can still hear the silence of the gathered crowd as they leaned forward, watching wounds as though the hand of God itself would be written in the skin. To them, healing was divine proof. There was also the cauldron of boiling water. The accused would plunge an arm to retrieve a stone from its depths, the scalding liquid searing flesh in an instant. Again, the wound became the text of God's judgment, read not by scholars, but by priests who examined the skin. Such trials carried a weight no earthly authority could match, for in every blister and scar, men saw the finger of heaven. It was brutal, yet deeply believed, for faith in divine justice was stronger than any doubt. Cold water, too, was called upon to reveal the truth. Bound with rope, the accused was lowered into a river or pond. If the body sank, it meant innocence, for the water had received them. If it floated, guilt was declared, for nature itself had rejected the soul. Many feared this ordeal, for survival often meant condemnation. I recall the cries of mothers watching their sons lowered into water, their prayers clashing with the chants of priests. It was as if nature and God stood in judgment side by side. Priests presided over these rituals with solemn care, blessing the water, consecrating the iron, ensuring that each act was framed as sacred. The Church's authority gave these ordeals weight, and for centuries they were accepted as just. Even kings deferred to their verdicts, for who would dare claim to overrule the Almighty? To participate was to surrender one's life to divine scrutiny, and many went forward with trembling faith, believing innocence would shield them from pain. Yet innocence was no guarantee of mercy. The ordeal was not carried out in secrecy, but before the eyes of community. Villagers gathered, lords attended, clergy prayed, and the accused stood alone. The spectacle bound society together in belief, for all witnessed the same sign, and all accepted its meaning. In such gatherings, justice was not a hidden judgment, but a shared experience, a communal acknowledgement that God had spoken. Fear and awe walked hand in hand, making the ordeal as much ritual as trial. But time wears away at even the strongest convictions. By the 13th century, doubts grew, and reason began to challenge faith. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 condemned the ordeal, forbidding clergy from participating. Without the Church's blessing, the practice withered, replaced slowly by new systems that sought evidence in testimony rather than in wounds. It was not an easy transition, for centuries of belief cannot be unlearned in a single decree. Still, the tide of justice shifted, carrying Europe into a new era. Even now, when I close my eyes by the fire, I see the glow of iron and the rippling of cold water. These ordeals remind me of how men once trusted the divine to speak through suffering, and how communities bound themselves to that faith. To face such a trial was to surrender completely, to place one's fate in hands unseen. And though the ordeals have passed into memory, their echo remains, whispering of a time when the measure of guilt was taken not by men, but by heaven itself. Not all disputes were left to the hands of priests or the signs of fire and water. Among the nobility, honor was defended not by testimony, but by steel. Trial by combat was born from the belief that God would grant victory to the righteous, that the sword could carve truth as clearly as any law. I remember fields marked for duels, solemn and silent before the clash, the ground consecrated as a sacred arena where justice and blood would mingle. It was not merely battle, it was judgment made flesh. The custom took root strongly in the lands of the Franks and spread throughout the Holy Roman Empire. In England, the Normans gave it new form after their conquest, binding it into law for both criminal and civil disputes. Nobles cherished this practice, for it placed justice within the code of knighthood, where valor was proof of truth. Even common men, if accused of grave crime, could demand combat, though they often lacked the means to prevail. Justice was tilted toward those who bore arms with skill. Each duel carried ritual. The combatants swore oaths before the fight, declaring their case as righteous. Weapons were chosen carefully: swords, maces, or even staves, depending on station and law. The ground itself was measured, and the fight was to continue until one yielded or fell. Some trials ended quickly, a single stroke deciding fate. Others dragged into exhaustion, both men collapsing in the dirt, their bodies testimony to the brutal search for divine favor. No parchment could carry such weight as the blood on the earth. Champions often fought in place of the accused, for not all had the strength or skill to take up arms. Wealthy nobles hired seasoned warriors to stand in their stead, believing the hand of God would still reveal the truth through the chosen blade. Yet many whispered of injustice, for how could divine judgment be measured if one side bought the skill of another? Still, the practice endured, for in the eyes of the age, the result was unquestionable once the duel was done. Women, too, could invoke combat in rare cases, though the law adapted in peculiar ways. If a woman accused a man, combat might be staged with adjustments. She armed with a stone or weight in cloth, he bound in a pit with one hand free. The spectacle shocked many, yet it reflected the belief that divine justice must be accessible to all, regardless of station or strength. These moments remain etched in my memory, for they revealed how deeply the people trusted the sword to speak God's will. As centuries passed, trial by combat grew increasingly ceremonial. Heralds announced the terms, lords presided, and rules of conduct were enforced. It became as much theatre as trial, a display of noble culture and martial valor. Crowds gathered not only to witness justice, but to see the clash of arms, to feel the trembling earth beneath iron boots. Justice became a spectacle, reinforcing the knightly order and reminding all that power and law were bound together in the dance of steel. Yet doubts crept into the heart of Christendom. By the late Middle Ages, jurists and clergy alike questioned whether combat truly reflected divine judgment or merely human strength. The rise of written law, professional courts, and evidence gradually eroded its place. Still, it lingered long in custom, with records of duels stretching even into the 15th century. Its endurance was proof of the medieval mind, where faith and force were inseparable. Tradition is slow to yield, especially when tied to honor. When I recall those contests, I hear not only the clash of weapons, but the silence that followed. The silence of verdict, of lives changed irrevocably. To stand in such combat was to place one's soul on the edge of a blade, trusting in God's unseen hand. And though time has carried us far from those bloody fields, the memory endures, a vision of justice forged in iron, where the truth was carved not in ink, but in wounds. There was a time when words carried the weight of iron, when to swear before God and men was as binding as any blade. In many villages and courts, disputes were not settled by combat or ordeal, but by the solemn oath of the accused. A man would stand before the assembly, hand upon holy relic or gospel, and declare his innocence. The gravity of such words was immense, for false swearing was believed to call divine punishment upon both soul and body. Silence fell heavily as oaths were spoken. Compurgation demanded more than the word of the accused alone. He was to summon oath helpers, neighbors, kin, or respected men of the community to stand beside him. These men did not testify to the facts, but to his character, swearing that he was honest and trustworthy. Their presence transformed the trial into a communal act, where the reputation of one became the responsibility of many. To refuse to support a man was itself a judgment, as loud as any sentence passed. The number of oath helpers varied depending on the gravity of the charge. For petty theft, a few might suffice. For accusations of grave crime, dozens could be required. The more serious the matter, the broader the circle of voices needed to sustain innocence. In this way, the strength of a man's ties within the community determined his fate. Justice here was not distant or abstract. It was bound to the measure of one's standing among peers. I recall seeing an accused man stand trembling, waiting for his companions to step forward. Some hesitated, fearing to share the weight of his oath. Others came eagerly, eager to shield a friend's name. In their eyes, I saw the delicate balance of loyalty and fear. For though they swore only to his honesty, the belief lingered that if they lied, God himself would reveal it through misfortune or death. To lend an oath was to risk the judgment of heaven. This practice reveals much about the medieval heart. Trust was the bedrock of justice, not evidence as we know it now. Character outweighed proof, and one's worth was measured by the voices willing to defend it. It was both merciful and dangerous, for the innocent but despised might fall, while the guilty but beloved could walk free. Yet to those who lived in tightly bound communities, it felt natural. Who knew a man better than those who worked and prayed beside him? The church sanctified these rituals, blessing the relics upon which men swore. Priests warned sternly of the eternal peril of false oaths, reminding all that God's ear was present at every word. In this way, the sacred and the social intertwined, reinforcing each other. Justice was not only the voice of neighbors, but the unseen gaze of the divine. To betray one's oath was to betray both God and community, a crime that carried shame beyond the grave. Gradually, compurgation waned as more formal systems of proof emerged. Yet for centuries, it endured as a trusted method, reflecting a world where truth was measured in the currency of honor. Even kings swore oaths to uphold treaties, and entire realms depended on the sanctity of words. The belief that divine punishment awaited liars gave oaths a strength no earthly penalty could match. In the absence of clear evidence, reputation and faith bore the burden of justice. When I remember those trials, I think of the trembling hands upon relics, the solemn faces of men swearing in unison, the air thick with both fear and reverence. It was a justice, fragile yet powerful, built on the fragile thread of trust. To face judgment through oaths was to lean upon the faith of others, to hope that their voices would shield you as surely as any wall. In that silence between words, lives were decided, and eternity seemed close enough to touch. When the Franks rose to power, they did not leave justice to chance. Their kings sought to bind their people with codes, written in a world still leaning heavily on memory. The Salic law, set down in the 6th century, became the cornerstone of Frankish order. It was a mixture of tribal tradition and Roman echo, preserved not in stone, but in parchment that passed from court to court. Each clause revealed a society that valued restitution over revenge, seeking to weigh loss with compensation. Vergild was central to this vision. Instead of endless blood feuds, payments were prescribed for injury, theft, and even killing. The worth of a man's life was measured in silver, the sum determined by rank and status. Nobles commanded higher vergild than peasants, showing how deeply inequality was woven into law. Yet for many, It offered a path away from violence, transforming vengeance into negotiation. I saw disputes settled not with bloodshed, but with coin, heavy purses carrying the weight of lives lost. The Salic law was precise, even meticulous in its details. It listed fines for broken bones, stolen livestock, damaged trees, and countless other offences. The aim was to account for every harm and assign a price. Justice here was mathematical, binding community through the balance of numbers. It struck me how this attempt at order reflected both Roman influence and tribal pragmatism. By codifying such matters, the Franks gave their people rules that could be carried beyond memory alone. Still, the law bore the marks of its time. Women were often treated as property in disputes, their rights narrow compared to men. Certain crimes against nobles carried far harsher penalties than the same acts against peasants. Justice was not equal, but stratified, echoing the social structure of the age. The codes preserved hierarchy as much as they preserved peace. To stand before a Frankish court was to see your worth measured not only by your deeds, but by your birth. Over time, the reach of these laws expanded. As the Frankish realm grew under Clovis and his successors, the codes spread across vast lands. Local customs still shaped judgments, but the written law offered a backbone. It carried the authority of the king, binding distant tribes under a single framework. I walked through villages where men recited these clauses, their voices steady, as though the law itself lent them strength. Written order gave the realm a unity that custom alone could not. Other tribes followed the Frankish example. The Burgundians, the Lombards, and the Visigoths each crafted their own codes, borrowing from Roman clarity while preserving native traditions. This weaving of influences created a tapestry of early medieval justice, diverse yet rooted in common ideas of restitution and balance. The Salic law was not an isolated text, but part of a broader effort to tame chaos with ink and decree. It became a model, shaping legal thought across Europe for centuries. These codes also laid the groundwork for later transformations. As kings and emperors sought to expand their power, the idea of written law offered them a tool for centralization. No longer could disputes rely solely on village elders. The king's law could reach across forests and rivers. In this way, the Salic law was both practical and political, asserting the presence of royal authority in the lives of ordinary men. Justice was no longer only communal, it became royal as well. Even now, I can almost hear the scratch of quills upon parchment, the steady recitation of clauses before an assembly, the clink of coins offered in settlement. The Frankish codes remind me of a world balancing between old feuds and new order. They reveal how law was shaped not by lofty ideals, but by the needs of survival, the desire to keep peace in a land fractured by rank and custom. In their numbers and fines, I see the beginnings of Europe's long road towards structured justice. In the days before William's banners crossed the Channel, England lived under a system of justice woven tightly with community life. Local courts, the hundred and shire courts, gathered free men to hear disputes and deliver judgment. These meetings were not the distant chambers of kings, but open assemblies where neighbours faced one another under the weight of custom. The people themselves bore responsibility for the order of their world, and their voices carried the sound of law. Attendance was more than duty, it was expectation. Free men were summoned to stand witness, not only to accusations, but to the procedures themselves. The presence of the community gave legitimacy to every outcome. To be absent was to neglect the bonds that tied one to land and kin. I have stood at such gatherings and felt the weight of belonging, where silence was as binding as speech. Justice was not the voice of one man, but the chorus of many. The ordeal was still called upon in those times, as water or fire revealed the supposed truth of a matter. Yet more often, oaths and fines decided the outcome. A man might swear his innocence, supported by oath helpers who vouched for his character. If his word stood firm, his case could be cleared. If not, fines were imposed, measured carefully according to the law. The practice reflected a world where trust and reputation were as valuable as gold. Virgil, too, shaped these courts. The death of a man was not answered only with vengeance but with compensation to the family. The sum varied by rank, echoing the inequalities of the time. To kill a noble cost far more than to kill a peasant, yet the principle was the same. Blood could be balanced with silver. This system, though imperfect, often prevented feuds that might otherwise have consumed entire families. It transformed violence into restitution, tempering anger with order. Communal responsibility extended even further. If a thief was not caught, neighbors might be held accountable for failing to raise the hue and cry. Villages carried the burden of justice together, for safety depended on vigilance. I saw how this bound people tightly, reminding each man that his neighbor's crime could become his own shame. It was a form of justice both harsh and protective, rooted in the soil of shared survival. Royal authority was present but not yet absolute. Kings issued laws, such as those of Alfred and later Canute, but enforcement still lay heavily in the hands of local assemblies. The king's word gave structure, yet the people's participation gave life. This balance between crown and community created a system both flexible and deeply communal. It was not law imposed from above, but law lived from within. I found it closer to the rhythm of the land than to the echo of empire. Witnesses played their part, though their role was not yet as it would become in later centuries. Their duty was less about recounting events and more about affirming the process, that summons had been made, that oaths had been spoken. In this way, they were guardians of order rather than narrators of truth. Their presence lent formality, ensuring that proceedings were remembered and respected. Without them, judgment could not stand firm. When I think back on Anglo-Saxon justice, I recall the open air of those courts, the gathering of men with calloused hands and weathered faces, the weight of words spoken in unison. It was a system deeply tied to kinship and land, fragile in some ways, resilient in others. Before the Normans imposed their might, England's justice was shaped by community, memory, and custom, a world where the voice of the people was both shield and sword in the endless struggle for order. When the Normans crossed the sea and claimed England, they brought more than lords and castles. They brought a vision of justice tied tightly to royal command. No longer would local assemblies alone decide disputes. William, stern and unyielding, demanded that trials serve the crown as much as the community. The air of judgment shifted from the open field to halls echoing with royal authority. It was the beginning of justice as a tool of kingship, binding all under one sovereign law. The Domesday Book stands in my memory as a symbol of this transformation. Compiled in 1086, it was not a law code, but a record of obligations, lands, and rights, an immense survey of England's wealth and people. Yet it carried the weight of authority, for knowledge was power, and William's knowledge made him master of the realm. With it, disputes over land could be settled with reference to the king's record. In this way, parchment became as powerful as sword. Royal writs soon followed, carrying justice in the name of the king to every corner of the land. These written commands summoned men to court or declared the crown's interest in a case. No longer did each shire stand apart, they were drawn into a single web of authority. I saw how men clutched these writs with trembling hands, for to disobey the king's word was perilous. The law was no longer only custom, it was the will of the crown inscribed in ink. Travelling justices embodied this new order. Sent by the king, they carried his authority across the kingdom, holding courts in towns and shires. Where once neighbours judged one another, now royal officers presided, their decisions binding by the power of monarchy. The sight of these men, robed and commanding, impressed upon the people that justice flowed not from village assemblies, but from the throne itself. It was a visible reminder of the crown's reach into daily life. The jury system began to stir in this period, though it bore little resemblance to what later centuries would know. Groups of local men were summoned not to weigh evidence impartially, but to declare what they already knew. They swore oaths to present the truth of their community, acting as witnesses bound together. It was the seed of a new way of trial, where collective testimony mattered more than divine ordeal. I saw the change take root slowly, like a young tree bending toward the sun. Norman justice also emphasized written record, far beyond what the Anglo-Saxons had preserved. Charters, rolls, and court registers ensured decisions would not vanish into memory alone. The permanence of ink gave the crown a weapon stronger than time, for once recorded, a judgment could be recalled and enforced. This shift marked a profound change in the rhythm of law. No longer fleeting words, but lasting records that tethered men to the authority of past rulings. The crown's control was not without resistance. Many freemen mourned the fading of their local assemblies, where their voices once carried weight. Yet the Norman system brought order, efficiency, and consistency, even if it cost the intimacy of communal judgment. Lords and peasants alike learned that disputes were no longer theirs to settle alone. The king's shadow stretched over every field, every manor, every hearth. Justice became a chain, linking all men to the throne. When I reflect on this transformation, I see both loss and gain. The warmth of communal assemblies gave way to the cold formality of royal courts, yet in that coldness lay stability. To face trial under Norman rule was to stand before the crown itself, bound by writ and record. It was a world where justice no longer wandered with custom, but marched in step with royal power, a new order that would shape England for centuries to come. In the 12th century, I witnessed the rise of something that felt both strange and promising: the jury. No longer was guilt left to boiling water, nor to the iron's burn. Instead, groups of local men were summoned to speak what they knew of a case. They were not judges in the way we understand today, but witnesses of community memory, carrying their oaths into the service of justice. It was a quiet revolution, shifting the weight of truth from divine ordeal to human voice. The reforms of Henry II gave this practice its strength. In 1166, through the Assize of Clarendon, he commanded that juries of 12 lawful men from each 100 and 4 from each vill should present those suspected of crimes. This innovation placed responsibility upon communities to identify wrongdoers, drawing them into the machinery of royal law. It bound men not only to one another, but to the crown, making them participants in a justice that stretched far beyond their village bounds. Those called to serve swore solemn oaths, not unlike those who stood as compurgators in earlier times. Yet their role was different. They were not defending a man's character, but investigating his deeds. They carried knowledge of local gossip, disputes, and transgressions, and their collective voice shaped the fate of the accused. In their testimony, I saw a new idea take root: that truth could be sought through the gathering of human knowledge rather than through divine trial. At first, these juries were far from impartial. Men chosen often knew the accused, the land, and the quarrels in question. Their verdicts reflected the entanglements of kinship and rivalry. Yet even with their flaws, the process carried a sense of practicality, absent from ordeal or combat. A wound could deceive, but the memories of a dozen men, however imperfect, offered a different kind of witness. It was justice rooted in lived experience, not in fire or steel. The use of juries expanded from criminal to civil cases, particularly in disputes over land. Instead of endless feuds or costly combats, sworn men could declare who held rightful claim. The crown favoured this, for it reduced bloodshed and placed disputes firmly under royal supervision. I recall the relief of peasants who no longer feared the ruin of feud, their fields secured by the word of a jury rather than the sword of a neighbour. This practice spread slowly, but its influence deepened. Other lands clung to inquisitorial methods, where judges questioned and investigated directly. England, however, walked another path, The jury became the crown's tool, binding the people to the system while granting them a voice within it. It was both duty and burden, for to serve was compulsory, and the consequences of verdicts weighed heavily on those who spoke them. Their oaths echoed long after the court dispersed. Over time, trial by jury began to erode the older ordeals. With the Church's condemnation of such rituals in 1215, the jury stood ready to fill the void. It became not just an experiment, but the foundation of a new order, one that placed the search for truth in human deliberation. Though imperfect, it carried within it the seed of the systems we know today. I sensed, even then, that history was shifting beneath my feet. When I think of those first juries, I see anxious faces gathered in wooden halls, men sworn to speak the truth as they knew it, however clouded by fear or bias. They were the voice of their communities, flawed yet vital, carrying the burden of justice on ordinary shoulders. From their beginnings came the long march toward modern trials, a reminder that even the humblest voices can shape the fate of nations. In their oaths lay the birth of a new age of law. By the 12th century, I saw the Church's system of justice grow into something more intricate than the assemblies of villagers or even the writs of kings. The turning point was Gratian's Decretum, compiled around 1140, which gathered centuries of scattered rulings into a single ordered body. It gave coherence to canon law, offering rules that reached across Christendom. To enter an ecclesiastical court was to step into a place where law was no longer oral and shifting, but carefully written and preserved. These courts handled disputes of faith, morality, and discipline. Marriage contracts, clerical misconduct, heresy, all fell within their reach. Their influence stretched wider than many realized, for such matters touched every household sooner or later. Priests and bishops presided, trained not only in scripture, but increasingly in legal scholarship. I recall their deliberate speech, each phrase tied to precedent, each decision backed by layers of text. Justice here felt less like ritual and more like reason, though always bound to the sacred. Written records became the lifeblood of these proceedings. Every accusation, testimony, and verdict was inscribed, forming archives that could be consulted and appealed. This permanence gave ecclesiastical trials a formality rare in secular courts of the time. A man's fate was no longer decided only by the memory of neighbours, but preserved on parchment for higher authorities to review. Such order carried both reassurance and dread, for once written, a judgment could not be easily forgotten. Advocates also emerged in this setting, men trained to argue cases with precision. Their words were not casual pleas, but structured reasoning, echoing the traditions of Roman law. The presence of advocates marked a profound change. Trials were no longer simply communal rituals, but contests of legal argument. Those who could afford skilled representation often fared better, revealing how knowledge of law could tilt the balance as much as wealth or birth. Procedures grew more sophisticated. Witnesses were called, their words recorded and compared. Cross-examinations sought to reveal contradictions, a practice that demanded sharp memory and courage. I watched men falter under questioning, their earlier words used against them. Truth became something pursued through dialogue and record, not just through oaths or ordeals. This gave the proceedings an air of scrutiny that felt both rigorous and intimidating. Appeals to higher authority reinforced the Church's dominance. If one felt wronged in a local judgment, the case could be carried upward, even to Rome itself. This hierarchy bound distant villages to the papal court, linking the smallest parish to the heart of Christendom. To stand in trial was to face not only local clergy, but the weight of an institution that spanned continents. Few dared resist such reach, for the Church's law stretched farther than any king's. The influence of these procedures seeped into secular justice. Kings and lords, seeing the order and permanence of canon law, began to imitate its practices. Written testimony, formal appeals, and reliance on professional advocates slowly reshaped secular courts. What began in the cloisters and cathedrals spilled into the wider world, showing how the Church's vision of justice could transform even the sword-bearing halls of kings. I look back on those ecclesiastical courts as places where faith and reason intertwined, where parchment and scripture stood side by side. To face trial, there was to be measured not by ordeal or combat, but by words weighed carefully and preserved for eternity. It was a justice that sought not only to punish, but to correct, binding men to the authority of both law and God. In their chambers, I saw the medieval world begin to move toward a more structured, enduring vision of justice. In time, the voices of men became more important than the signs of fire, water, or iron. I watched as trials slowly turned toward witnesses, those who had truly seen or heard events unfold. Their words were no longer about character alone, as in compurgation, but about facts. What the eyes had seen, what the ears had heard, these became the new foundation of judgment. It was a fragile shift, for memory can bend and truth can falter, yet it marked a step toward evidence as we know it today. The role of a witness was not taken lightly. Sworn before God, they carried the weight of divine judgment upon their testimony. To speak falsely was believed to endanger the soul, drawing eternal punishment. Still, fear of earthly lords, pressure from kin, and the lure of favor sometimes clouded their word. I remember faces pale with terror as men balanced loyalty to friends against the peril of lying under oath. Truth became a battlefield of conscience, fought within the heart. Witnesses often came from the same community as the accused. This gave strength to their testimony, for they knew the rhythms of their neighbors' lives. Yet it also brought danger, for rivalry, jealousy, or debt could shape their words. A farmer wronged by a boundary dispute might testify with venom. A neighbor indebted to the accused might bend truth in his favor. Thus, justice was bound tightly to the fabric of village life, with all its tangled loyalties. By the 13th century, reliance on witnesses was especially strong in inquisitorial courts across continental Europe. Judges questioned them directly, writing down their responses for careful comparison. It was a methodical approach, far from the communal oaths of earlier centuries. The judge sought contradictions, probing the details of time, place, and action. I saw how this gave trials a colder air, less ritual, more interrogation. The human voice was sharpened into evidence, dissected by questioning. Not all witnesses were treated equally. The standing of the person mattered greatly. A noble's testimony could outweigh that of several peasants, and women's voices were often discounted unless supported by men. The law mirrored the hierarchy of society, giving weight where power lay. To face trial meant not only meeting the facts, but meeting the measure of who was allowed to speak with authority. Justice bent toward the voices of the privileged. Despite these flaws, the presence of witnesses gradually replaced the reliance on ordeal. After the Lateran Council of 1215 forbade clergy from blessing such rituals, communities sought new methods. Testimony filled the void, imperfect but human, grounded in observation rather than divine sign. This shift brought law closer to reason, though never free from bias. It was a step away from trial as ritual and toward trial as inquiry. Witnesses also provided a sense of accountability. Their words were written, preserved in court records that could be appealed to higher authorities. This permanence carried weight, for once inscribed, testimony could be revisited. A false word might linger for years, a shadow upon parchment. In this way, trials gained continuity across time, and justice began to build upon itself rather than vanish with memory. When I reflect upon those faces summoned to speak, I hear the tremor in their voices, the hush of the assembly as truth or falsehood took shape in the air. Witnesses gave trials a human center, grounding judgment in the frailty of perception. To face judgment, then was to stand not before flames or rivers, but before the eyes and tongues of one's neighbors, whose memories could condemn or absolve. In their fragile words, the destiny of men was written. While England walked the path of jury trials, much of continental Europe shaped justice through another model. Judges themselves took the role of investigator, questioning the accused and gathering testimony. This inquisitorial system, deeply influenced by Roman and canon law, sought truth through written records rather than community assembly. It was a system of procedure, precise and structured, where authority lay firmly in the hands of the judge. I remember watching such hearings, their order cold and exact, a far cry from the noisy gatherings of village courts. The judge was no passive figure. He summoned witnesses, interrogated the accused, and compiled the record. Every word spoken was set down in writing, preserved as permanent evidence. In this, the inquisitorial process differed sharply from the oral customs of earlier times. The parchment became the true stage of justice, each testimony inked carefully so it could be weighed and compared. It was a method that gave trials a lasting presence, binding them to the written word rather than fleeting memory. Inquisitorial courts reflected the growing influence of universities, especially Bologna and Paris, where scholars studied Roman and canon law. The judges were often trained men, versed in legal theory as well as procedure. Their decisions carried the air of learned authority, drawing upon ancient precedent as well as scripture. I recall the way they spoke, with citations and references, as though the past itself leaned over their shoulder. Their pens were as sharp as swords, and often more decisive, yet this system placed immense power in the hands of the judge. He was investigator, examiner, and final arbiter, though appeals could rise to higher courts. The accused stood at a disadvantage, with little room to argue when every word could be twisted into record. Many feared these trials, for the formality left little space for mercy or communal balance. Justice here felt distant, carried not by neighbors, but by authority imposed from above. Despite its sternness, the inquisitorial system brought consistency. Across France, the Holy Roman Empire and beyond, cases were recorded with a level of detail unknown to earlier generations. Theft, land disputes, heresy, all were given structure through formal inquiry. This uniformity allowed rulers to extend their authority more evenly, binding diverse regions under a single legal order. It was a tool not only of justice, but of governance, strengthening central power. The emphasis on interrogation marked a change in the experience of the accused. Instead of proving innocence through ordeal or oath, one had to withstand questioning. Judges sought contradictions, pressing for clarity, probing until the truth or a confession emerged. I saw men falter under such scrutiny, their voices stumbling as fatigue and fear overcame them. It was a trial of endurance as much as of facts, demanding resilience of both body and spirit. Not all saw this as progress. Some lamented the loss of communal participation, where neighbors shaped justice together. Others feared the growing bureaucracy, with its endless parchment and stern officials. Yet, there were those who welcomed the order it brought, tired of the uncertainty of custom and the violence of feud. To them, the inquisitorial model offered stability, even if it came at the cost of closeness. Justice became more uniform, but also more remote. I recall the hush of those chambers, the scratching of quills, the measured voice of the judge reading from his notes. It was a justice heavy with formality, carved into parchment rather than memory. To face trial in continental Europe was to stand before the authority of learned men, their eyes sharp, their pens relentless. It was a world where truth was sought through method and record, a step toward modernity, though never free of its own shadows. In the lands bound by feudal ties, justice often rested in the hands of the lords. Each noble presided over his own court, judging tenants, vassals, and serfs. These gatherings took place in great halls or open fields, with the lord seated high, his retainers at his side. The authority he carried was not just military, but judicial, for within his domain he was both protector and judge. To live under feudal rule was to know that justice was as close as one's lord, yet also as partial as his favour. The privilege of nobility extended deeply into these courts. A lord accused of wrongdoing could claim trial only before his peers, never before peasants or lesser men. This right of trial by equals preserved the dignity of their rank, ensuring they were judged by those who shared their station. I remember whispers among the serfs, bitter at such inequality, for their fates were decided by lords who could never be tried by them in return. Justice was a mirror of society's rigid order. For peasants, the weight of these courts was often harsh. Offences, as small as gathering wood from the wrong forest or grazing animals on forbidden land, could bring fines or corporal punishment. Lords enforced their rights zealously, for these small dues sustained their wealth. I saw bent backs and lowered eyes as men and women stood before their masters, their pleas swallowed by the formality of custom. The law in these halls was less about fairness than about maintaining obedience. Yet even in their severity, feudal courts offered a kind of stability. Local disputes over boundaries, debts, or inheritances were resolved under the authority of someone known to the community. The lord's presence gave weight to decisions, and the threat of his power discouraged endless feuds. There was comfort for some in knowing where judgment lay, even if that judgment was far from equal. Fear and stability walked hand in hand across the manors of Europe. Nobles often preferred negotiation and settlement among themselves, sparing bloodshed when possible. Marriage alliances, land exchanges, and sworn oaths frequently resolved conflicts before they reached open trial. But when disputes did erupt, the spectacle of peers judging peers reinforced their solidarity. These trials were less about uncovering truth than about preserving the honor and unity of the noble class. I saw in them the careful dance of pride and privilege, where justice was entwined with power. The presence of retainers and vassals lent these courts an atmosphere of ritual. Heralds announced proceedings, clerks recorded outcomes, and judgments were sometimes proclaimed with symbolic acts. The breaking of a rod, the handing over of soil. Such ceremonies underscored the authority of the Lord, reminding all present that justice was not abstract, but embodied in his person. The trial became both law and theatre, a display meant to reinforce loyalty and hierarchy. Tensions often simmered between feudal justice and royal authority. Kings sought to centralize power, challenging the independence of lords who judged freely within their domains. Appeals to higher courts slowly eroded the absolute control of local nobles. Yet for centuries, manorial and feudal courts remained the daily face of justice for most of Europe, shaping lives more directly than the distant commands of monarchs. Their persistence showed how deeply rooted privilege was in the soil of society. When I recall those courts, I see serfs trembling under judgment, nobles sitting with composed dignity, and the ever-present gulf between the two. To face trial, there was to confront the reality of status, where one's birth determined not only how one lived, but how one was judged. It was a system that bound people together, yet kept them apart, a reflection of feudal order itself. Justice was never blind. It wore the garments of rank, stitched tightly into the fabric of medieval life. With the growth of towns, justice began to take on a new shape. The walls that enclosed merchants and craftsmen also enclosed new systems of law, born from the needs of trade and urban life. Guilds, councils, and merchant courts rose to settle disputes swiftly, for the rhythm of commerce could not wait on the slow turns of feudal or royal justice. In these bustling centres, trials sought efficiency, balancing fairness with the urgency of markets. The hammer of trade demanded judgments as steady as coin. Guild courts were among the most influential. Bakers, weavers, and smiths each had their associations, and within them, discipline was enforced. To sell bread of false weight or cloth of poor weave invited censure from one's peers. I witnessed such gatherings, where a master stood before fellow craftsmen, his reputation at stake. Punishments could be fines, suspension, or even expulsion from the guild. The authority of these courts rested not on the sword, but on the power of belonging. Exclusion meant ruin. Merchant courts, too, carried special significance. Disputes over contracts, debts, or shipments were judged with speed, often in the language of commerce rather than of kings. These courts valued written agreements and records, rare outside urban life. I saw how a scrap of parchment with seals and marks could carry more weight than an oath alone. In trade, trust was measured not only by reputation but by documents, foreshadowing the world of law we know now. Urban magistrates presided over wider city courts, where order extended beyond guild and market. Theft, assault, and disorder within the walls fell under their eye. These judges were often chosen from the wealthy citizens, men who had a stake in the city's peace. Their rulings blended custom with emerging statutes, creating a patchwork of urban law that reflected the growing independence of towns. Justice here felt different, neither fully feudal nor entirely royal, but civic in spirit. The speed of these courts contrasted sharply with rural trials. A case might be heard and judged within days, for delay threatened trade and stability. This urgency shaped their procedures, pushing them toward clarity and record-keeping. I remember merchants praising this swiftness, for a ship could not wait at harbour, nor goods rot in warehouses while disputes lingered. Law became an instrument of commerce, as vital as scales or ledgers. Written contracts played a central role. Sealed in wax, witnessed by scribes, these documents gave substance to promises. Breaches were pursued vigorously, for trust was the lifeblood of trade. In these contracts, one sees the beginnings of commercial law that would echo through later centuries. The reliance on writing, more than on oral oath, reflected the literacy of cities, where clerks and notaries thrived. The quill, as much as the sword, upheld justice. Still, these urban courts did not exist in isolation. Kings and lords often sought to impose their authority, challenging the independence of towns. Yet charters granted by monarchs allowed many cities to govern their own justice, affirming privileges that made them semi-autonomous. I walked through such towns where citizens spoke proudly of their liberties, their laws born from their own councils rather than imposed by distant rulers. Justice became a marker of freedom as much as of order. In the end, urban justice revealed a changing world. The fields of feudalism gave way to the markets of trade, and with them came laws that mirrored the pulse of commerce. To stand trial in these courts was to be judged by peers of craft and trade, where reputation and record intertwined. It was a justice alive with the hum of cities, a sign that medieval law was not fixed but evolving, shaped by the ceaseless flow of human need. Punishment in the Middle Ages carried many faces, some light, others unbearably heavy. Not every crime led to the gallows. Often, fines sufficed to settle disputes, especially for lesser offences. These fines were carefully measured, written into codes that valued both man and property. Yet they were not equal across ranks. A noble might pay silver for what a peasant could be whipped for. The scales of justice weighted by birth. Such imbalance was accepted as the order of the age, though it often bred quiet resentment. Public humiliation stood among the most common penalties. The pillory and the stocks were fixtures in market squares, where offenders sat exposed to the scorn of neighbours. I have seen children throw rotten fruit, women spit, and men jeer at those confined. The punishment lay not in pain alone, but in shame, for reputation was life in those times. To be mocked openly was to carry a stain that clung long after the punishment ended. Community memory was harsher than any chain. Mutilation, too, was used as deterrence. A thief might lose a hand, a forger his fingers, a liar his tongue. These punishments carried symbolic weight, stripping the guilty of the very tools with which they offended. The sight of such wounds marked men forever. Their bodies turned into living testimonies of their crimes. I recall the silence of crowds after such sentences, a silence heavier than laughter, for it bore the weight of fear. the body itself became the judge's parchment. Exile was another fate, a tearing of roots from soil and kin. To be cast out of one's village or city was to lose not only home but identity, for survival depended on belonging. Those banished wandered like shadows, distrusted wherever they went. In many ways, it was a slower death, stripping a man of his place in the world. I met such souls along the road, their eyes hollow, their voices carrying the bitterness of endless displacement. Execution, however, stood at the pinnacle of punishment. Hanging was the common fate of thieves and murderers, swift yet public. Nobles might be beheaded, a cleaner death that reflected their status. Burning was reserved for heretics and witches, the flames carrying symbolic weight as purifiers of sin. Each method spoke not only of justice, but of order, reminding all that certain crimes defied forgiveness. The spectacle was meant to instill fear as much as to avenge wrongs. These punishments were always public, staged with careful intent. Lords and kings wanted justice seen, not hidden. Crowds gathered, markets paused, and entire villages came to witness the finality of judgment. The ritual itself carried meaning, the reading of the sentence, the solemn procession, the moment of silence before the act. Justice was theatre, a stage upon which power displayed itself. In these moments, fear was woven into the very fabric of daily life. Yet not all punishments were cruel. Fines and compensation remained the backbone of many trials, especially in disputes over property or injury. The idea of balance persisted. A wrong done could be righted through silver, restoring peace without bloodshed. In such cases, punishment aimed not at destruction, but at reconciliation. This revealed the dual nature of medieval justice, both merciful and merciless, depending on the crime and the status of the accused. When I think back, I see justice not as blind, but as a mirror of power. It sought to deter, to humiliate, to control, and sometimes to reconcile. To face trial meant not only to risk punishment, but to become part of a spectacle that reinforced order. From the pillory to the scaffold, from the clinking of coins to the crackling of flames, punishment in the Middle Ages was never private. It was carved into memory, binding fear and obedience into the hearts of all who watched. The 13th century brought a darker face of justice, one born not of theft or feud, but of faith itself. Heresy was seen as a poison, not only against the church but against the soul of the community. To question doctrine, to deny sacrament, to follow teachings outside the fold. These acts became crimes of the gravest kind. I remember the whispers around villages when men spoke of the Cathars in the south of France, their beliefs condemned as a threat to Christendom. Fear spread as quickly as fire through dry fields. Pope Gregory IX formalized this fear in 1231, creating the Papal Inquisition. Its task was not to punish thieves or murderers, but to seek out heretics wherever they might be found. Inquisitors were dispatched, often Dominican friars, trained in theology and relentless in purpose. They carried authority that reached above kings, answering directly to Rome. I saw them arrive in towns with solemn faces, their presence heavy with dread, for no one knew whose words or silences might draw suspicion. The procedure of heresy trials was meticulous. Accusations could come anonymously, fueling mistrust among neighbors. The accused was summoned, examined, and urged to confess. Confession was sought as the surest proof, for the church desired not only punishment, but repentance. Yet the weight of interrogation, and at times coercion, pressed heavily upon the accused. Many faltered, confessing to save their souls even when their hearts still clung to their faith. In those chambers, silence became perilous. Punishments for heresy varied. Some were ordered to fast, to wear a cross upon their clothing, to journey barefoot in penance. Others, deemed obstinate, faced imprisonment for life. But for the unrepentant, the sentence was death, often by fire. The church declared it cleansed the soul, even as the body turned to ash. I stood among crowds who watched the flames, their faces pale with awe and fear. The spectacle reminded all that faith and law had become inseparably bound. The Cathar Crusade, or Albigensian Crusade, stands as a memory carved in blood. Armies marched not only to conquer land, but to eradicate heresy. Villages burned, and entire communities vanished under the banner of orthodoxy. Inquisition followed where swords had cut, ensuring that belief itself was brought to heel. Justice in those days was not merely about order, it was about preserving one vision of truth, even at the cost of thousands of lives. Later, the Inquisition turned its gaze upon the Knights Templar. Once revered as defenders of the Holy Land, they became accused of blasphemy and corruption in 1307. Their trials were tangled with politics and envy, as kings sought their wealth and the church its authority. I remember the shock when these warriors, once blessed, stood bound and condemned. Their downfall revealed how heresy charges could be wielded as weapons of power, reshaping kingdoms as much as doctrines. The machinery of the Inquisition spread widely across Europe, formalized in tribunals that recorded every testimony and verdict. Fear became constant, for belief was no longer private, but subject to scrutiny. Families kept silent at their own tables, unsure of who might report careless words. Faith itself felt like a trial, tested not only by God, but by men with ink and seal. Justice had become a guardian of doctrine, wielding parchment and flame together. When I reflect on those years, I feel the chill of suspicion that haunted entire villages. Trials for heresy were not about theft of bread or land, but about the soul's alignment with heaven. To face them was to stand before a power greater than any king, a power that reached into conscience itself. The Inquisition reminds me of how fear and faith can entwine, forging a justice that sought purity, yet left scars on the memory of all who lived beneath its gaze. Toward the end of the medieval centuries, I watched suspicion turn its gaze upon those accused of witchcraft. Though great hunts would come later, the seeds were already sown in the 14th and 15th centuries. Fear of the devil's hand lingered in every village misfortune. A sick child, a failed harvest, a storm that shattered roofs. It was easier for many to believe that malice, not chance, lay behind such calamities. And so, neighbours turned on neighbours, the air heavy with distrust. Trials for witchcraft did not yet carry the frenzy of later years, but they grew steadily. Women were most often accused, especially those who lived at the margins of society. Widows, midwives, or healers who worked with herbs. Their knowledge, once sought after, became a source of suspicion. I remember the uneasy silence when such women walked through markets, the way eyes followed them, half in need, half in fear. Accusation was never far behind. The church's influence shaped these proceedings. Manuals on detecting witches began to circulate, and sermons warned of hidden servants of Satan. By 1487, the Malleus Maleficarum gave detailed guidance on identifying, prosecuting, and condemning supposed witches. Its pages carried both theology and law, feeding courts with justification. I once saw it in the hands of an inquisitor, its lines read aloud as if they were scripture itself. The book spread fear like fire across dry timber. The trials themselves often mirrored inquisitorial methods. Interrogations pressed the accused, sometimes with threats or coercion. Confessions were drawn, often under duress, and then recorded as proof. Some women admitted to impossible acts, flying through the night, consorting with demons, not from guilt, but from exhaustion and fear. Their words, wrung from them, sealed their fate. It was a justice that claimed to defend the faith, but left sorrow in its wake. Punishments varied. Some accused were fined, others shamed, and in harsher cases, executed. Burning was the fate most feared, a fire meant to purify the soul as it destroyed the body. The sight of smoke rising over fields was a grim warning to all. I recall villagers standing in silence as the flames consumed the condemned, their faces pale with dread. No one dared speak, for to defend the accused was to risk sharing their fate. Superstition and social strain often fueled these accusations. In times of famine, plague, or war, the urge to find a culprit grew strong. The weak, the different, or the outspoken became easy targets. To accuse was to deflect blame, to shield oneself from suspicion. I heard confessions whispered in fear, not of guilt but of desperation, for sometimes survival meant pointing to another. Thus, trials of witchcraft reflected not only belief in demons, but the anxieties of communities under strain. Though kings and princes sometimes hesitated, local courts embraced these cases with zeal. The spectacle of rooting out evil gave authority to both clergy and magistrates. It reassured the frightened that order was being defended, even as it deepened divisions. To face such a trial was to confront not only the court, but the weight of fear that hung over an entire village. One woman's guilt became the community's uneasy peace. When I recall those trials, I do not see witches but human beings caught in webs of suspicion and fear. The Middle Ages, for all its faith, could not escape the shadows of superstition. Witchcraft trials stand as a reminder that justice was often entwined with fear, where the unknown was punished as evil. The crackle of flames in the night spoke less of truth than of the deep anxieties of a world seeking answers in judgment. In rare and perilous moments, even kings and nobles were brought before judgment. Such trials were never ordinary, for they carried the weight of kingdoms upon their shoulders. To see a crowned head or a great lord stand accused was to witness the fragility of power. Justice here was never free of politics, for each verdict echoed through courts and battlefields alike. I remember how whispers spread faster than swords when nobility faced the stain of accusation. One of the most haunting memories is that of Joan of Arc. In 1431, the young woman who had led armies under divine claim was tried in Rouen under English and ecclesiastical authority. Her trial was less about her visions than about the politics of war. The proceedings were meticulous, with transcripts kept, but the outcome was decided long before the first question was asked. To watch her condemned as heretic and burned was to see justice wielded as a weapon of conquest. Baronial revolts often ended with trials too. Nobles who defied their kings sought to defend themselves through rights of feudal law, demanding trial by peers. Yet, when rebellion shook thrones, such rights were easily bent or ignored. Some were executed, others stripped of lands, their names dragged into infamy. I remember the tension in great halls when peers judged peers, the silence heavy with fear that tomorrow's accuser could become tomorrow's accused. The trial of Thomas Becket's murderers offers another shadowed tale. Though Becket himself was not noble but archbishop, the knights who killed him faced immense scrutiny. Their actions, though taken in service to Henry II, cast a long stain on both crown and realm. The aftermath showed how trials of high figures were bound not only to law, but to the shaping of legacy. In such cases, history itself was a courtroom, deciding reputations long after the verdict. High nobles often wielded their privilege to negotiate outcomes. Some secured exile instead of death, their wealth and connections protecting them. Others bargained for clemency by yielding lands or oaths of loyalty. Such bargains revealed how trials at this level were rarely about guilt alone. They were stages where alliances shifted and crowns tightened or loosened their grip. The dance of law and politics was inseparable, and the line between justice and expedience blurred. Special courts were sometimes convened for such trials. Parliaments, royal councils, or ecclesiastical assemblies gathered to lend weight to proceedings. Their presence was meant to cloak judgment in legitimacy, though few doubted the hand of power guiding the outcome. To be tried as a noble was to stand before institutions designed as much to display authority as to uncover truth. These courts were spectacles, reinforcing hierarchy even as they threatened its highest ranks. The people too watched closely. A trial of royalty was not confined to cloisters or palaces. It echoed through taverns and marketplaces. Common folk measured their rulers by the justice meted out at such moments. If a noble escaped with light punishment, resentment festered. If one fell harshly, fear rippled through the land. These trials shaped not only law, but the bond between ruler and ruled, weaving justice into the very fabric of loyalty. Looking back, I see these trials as fragile balancing acts. They were not only about crime, but about the preservation of order, the maintenance of power, and the writing of history. To face judgment as royalty or high nobility was to stand in the storm where politics, law, and faith collided. Their echoes remind us that in the Middle Ages, justice at the highest level was never blind. It was a mirror reflecting the struggles of kingdoms themselves. Justice in the Middle Ages was never hidden behind closed doors. It unfolded before the eyes of the people, binding entire communities in the drama of judgment. Trials and punishments were staged not only to decide guilt, but to remind all of the power that governed them. The public square became a theatre where law, faith, and authority played their roles. I have stood among those crowds, the air thick with anticipation, as justice turned into spectacle. Executions drew the greatest gatherings. The gallows loomed over towns as symbols of order, visible from afar to all who approached. When a sentence was carried out, villagers and townsfolk left their work to witness it. The act itself mattered less than the message. Disobedience would not go unanswered. The sound of prayers, cries, and the thud of the final moment etched themselves deep into memory, ensuring that justice was remembered long after the body was gone. Punishments of humiliation also thrived on community presence. The pillory, the stocks, the cucking stool, all invited scorn from neighbours. The offender sat helpless as insults and missiles rained down. This participation gave people a sense of ownership over justice, as though the punishment belonged to them as much as to the court. I recall the jeers echoing in markets, laughter mingling with anger, turning punishment into communal ritual. Shame was sharpened by the eyes of many. Even trials themselves were performed before audiences. Local assemblies summoned free men not only to witness, but to voice judgment. Their presence gave legitimacy to the process, for justice without witnesses carried no weight. Each man's attendance affirmed the law, binding the community together. I saw how gossip and collective memory shaped outcomes, for all knew the reputations of those who stood accused. Truth in such settings was as much social as it was legal. Religious ceremonies amplified these moments. Sentences might be read in churches, punishments preceded by sermons, and executions framed as acts of divine justice. The mingling of ritual and law gave solemnity to every act. To the people, it was not only the Lord or King who punished, but God himself. I remember the toll of bells as men were led to their fate, each sound a reminder that the community shared in the weight of judgment. This visibility also created deterrence. The fear of being seen, mocked, or executed before one's neighbours kept many from transgression. Law was not enforced solely by authority, but by the memory of public spectacle. Children grew up watching punishments, learning early the consequences of defiance. These sights lingered in their minds, shaping behaviour more effectively than unseen threats ever could. Justice lived in the memory of what was seen and shared. The spectacle also reinforced hierarchy. Nobles judged, clergy blessed, and commoners watched. Each role reflected one's place in the order of society. The people participated, but always within boundaries set from above. Their voices were heard in assemblies, their hands hurled fruit at the pillory, but the ultimate authority remained distant. Still, this participation bound them to the system, making them both subjects of and contributors to justice. When I recall these gatherings, I feel again the mixture of awe, fear, and fascination that filled the air. Public justice was not only about law, but about reminding all of their place in the great order of things. To face trial in such a world was to face not only a judge, but the gaze of the entire community. In those moments, guilt or innocence mattered less than the lesson etched into the hearts of all who watched. As centuries advanced, I saw trials grow more complex, no longer carried by oaths and memory alone. A new figure appeared in court, the trained lawyer, the advocate who spoke on behalf of others. Their voices were honed not by plough or sword, but by study, shaped in the halls of universities. They turned trials into contests of knowledge, where mastery of law mattered as much as the facts themselves. It was the birth of a new profession, one that altered justice forever. The universities of Bologna and Paris became the cradles of this change. There, scholars pored over Roman law and canon law, reviving the wisdom of antiquity. They wrote, debated, and taught, forging minds capable of navigating the complexities of legal codes. I remember meeting young men whose tongues moved with precision, their words like finely sharpened blades. Their power was not in arms, but in arguments, and with them they began to sway courts. Advocates served as guides for those who faced trial. Peasants, merchants, even nobles sought their counsel, for the language of law was becoming too intricate for common understanding. An accused man might falter before a judge, but an advocate could speak with clarity, weaving evidence and precedent together. This gave rise to both hope and inequality, for those who could pay for skilled defense stood stronger than those left to stumble alone. Written records became their battlefield. Lawyers cited previous cases, charters, and decrees, building arguments that reached beyond a single village or generation. In their hands, justice began to take on continuity as each trial echoed those before it. The memory of law shifted from the voices of elders to the parchment of scholars. I saw how this deepened the sense of permanence, binding men not only to their community, but to an ever-expanding body of written wisdom. Some clergy became notable advocates, trained in canon law and skilled in disputation. Their dual authority of faith and learning made them formidable. Secular courts, too, began to recognize the value of legal professionals, employing them as judges and advisors. This mingling of sacred and scholarly-shaped trials into carefully staged proceedings, with advocates standing as mediators between accused and authority. Their rise signaled the dawn of a new order in which knowledge itself was power. Yet resentment brewed against them. Many common folk saw lawyers as manipulators of words, twisting truth to serve the wealthy. Their presence seemed to make trials less about right and wrong and more about who could command the strongest arguments. I heard curses whispered against them in taverns, men claiming justice had become the property of the learned. Still, their role only grew, for courts themselves relied upon their skill to keep proceedings orderly. Kings and lords welcomed this new class, for it strengthened their control. With professional advocates and judges, law could be applied with greater consistency across vast territories. This allowed rulers to bind diverse lands under a single legal framework. What began in village squares was now reshaped by parchment, procedure, and the voices of trained men. It was a shift from custom to codification, from community memory to legal institution. As I reflect, I see these advocates as heralds of change. They carried justice away from the communal rituals of oaths and ordeals into a realm of written precedent and learned debate. To face trial now was to face not only the judgment of peers or lords, but the sharp reasoning of professionals who lived by law. Their rise marked the slow transformation of justice into something more enduring, though never free from inequality. In their words, the Middle Ages heard the first notes of modern law. By the 13th century, I witnessed courts turn to methods that chilled the soul. Torture, once resisted, became sanctioned in many inquisitorial systems as a means to extract confessions. The belief was simple, yet cruel. Truth could be forced from the body when the tongue resisted. Judges and inquisitors justified it by claiming the salvation of souls required certainty, even if certainty was wrung from screams. I remember the dread that filled towns when whispers spread that torture might be employed in trials. The strappado was among the most feared. The accused was bound with hands tied behind the back and hoisted by rope, then dropped suddenly, wrenching joints with unbearable pain. I heard of men who confessed to anything demanded, not from guilt, but from the agony tearing through their bodies. The rack, too, stretched limbs beyond endurance, bones cracking, muscles tearing. These devices were not hidden. Their very presence in courtrooms symbolized the reach of authority into flesh itself. Torture was used most often in cases of heresy, where the stakes were eternal salvation. The inquisitors argued that lies endangered not only the accused, but the whole community. If heresy spread, it could damn many souls, and thus extraordinary measures were justified. Yet the confessions gathered under torment were often contradictory, filled with wild details that matched the expectations of the interrogators. I saw how desperation to stop the pain-shaped words more than truth ever could. There were rules, or so they claimed. Torture could not be applied without sufficient suspicion, and it was not supposed to cause permanent injury or death. Records show how inquisitors wrote carefully that sessions were moderate. Yet in practice, the limits blurred, for who could measure moderation in suffering? Once the threshold of pain was crossed, the line between justice and cruelty vanished. Mercy was a word seldom heard in those chambers. Despite its brutality, many believed torture revealed divine justice. If the accused was guilty, God allowed pain to force confession. If innocent, some hoped endurance might reveal their purity. But few could endure. I remember hearing of rare cases where men held fast to silence, becoming legends of resilience, though their bodies broke. For most, torment led to words, and words led to sentences. The court declared the confession proof, while the community whispered doubts. The use of torture spread across Europe, especially under inquisitorial systems in France, Spain, and the Empire. Secular courts adopted it too, particularly in cases of treason. Rulers claimed it protected kingdoms. As heresy threatened faith, so treason threatened thrones. I saw how alike these charges became, both framed as cancers that justified extraordinary remedies. Whether against God or king, the body of the accused bore the punishment of suspicion. Some voices rose against the practice. Jurists argued that confessions gained under pain were unreliable. Priests warned that torment endangered the soul of the torturer as well as the victim. Yet their protests rarely silenced the tools of interrogation. The fear of heresy, rebellion, and disorder outweighed doubts. The courts clung to torture, convinced that without it, justice could not be secured. And so the cries of the suffering echoed through stone walls for generations. As I sit by the fire now, I cannot forget the weight of those memories. Torture stands as a reminder of how far men will go when certainty is demanded at any. To face trial in those days was to risk not only judgment but torment, where truth was measured in broken bodies and confessions carved from pain. Justice claimed to protect the soul, yet in its zeal, it scarred flesh and memory alike. In the year 1215, a parchment was sealed at Runnymede that would echo far beyond its time. The Magna Carta, drawn from the struggle between King John of England and his barons, sought to place limits upon royal authority. It was not meant for peasants or common folk, but for the powerful lords who feared the king's unchecked will. Yet in its lines lay principles that would grow roots far deeper than any had foreseen. I recall the murmur of awe when word of this charter spread. The barons forced John's hand after years of heavy taxation and arbitrary rule. They demanded assurances that justice would not bend solely to the king's desires. Among its clauses stood one that resounded above all, that no free man could be imprisoned or punished without lawful judgment by his peers or by the law of the land. These words were a shield, meant to protect the nobility, but they planted seeds that would, in time, extend more widely. The Magna Carta did not end tyranny overnight. John sought annulment from the Pope, and civil war soon followed. Still, the document returned again and again, reissued by later kings who recognized its symbolic power. Its survival gave barons and later parliaments a weapon against overreach. I saw how it transformed from a desperate compromise into a cornerstone of English identity. The parchment grew stronger than the hand that first resisted it. Trials under its promise began to change. No longer could the crown so easily imprison without cause. Men gained the right to demand judgment under the law, however narrowly defined at first. This shifted the balance between ruler and ruled, making justice not only the king's tool, but a principle that even he was bound to respect. It was the beginning of the idea that authority itself must be subject to law. The concept of due process found its earliest expression here. Though limited in scope, it carried the notion that rights were not gifts from the crown, but protections held against it. The words of Magna Carta resonated in courtrooms, invoked by those seeking fairness. I recall lawyers citing its lines, their voices steady, as though speaking from scripture. In this way, it shaped not just politics, but the very rhythm of justice. Beyond England, its influence spread slowly, carried by the idea that rulers must be restrained. It inspired charters, councils, and reforms across Europe, though each adapted it to local needs. The memory of that summer at Runnymede became a symbol of resistance against arbitrariness. Even centuries later, when men sought liberty, they reached back to Magna Carta as proof that law could stand above power. Its legacy refused to fade. Yet it must be remembered that the common man in those days saw little change. Serfs remained bound to lords, and peasants still faced the weight of manorial justice. The Charter spoke the language of nobles, not of ploughmen. Still, its principles carried within them the possibility of a broader future. It was like a stone cast into water, its ripples unseen at first, but widening with time. As I reflect, I see Magna Carta not as a sudden transformation, but as a milestone. To face trial after its sealing was to know that even kings had limits, however frail those limits first appeared. It marked the slow birth of a world where law sought to restrain authority, where justice became more than the will of one man. Its spirit endures, a reminder that power is strongest when tempered by fairness. For most who tilled the soil, justice was not decided in royal halls or under cathedral arches, but in the manor courts of their lords. These gatherings, held in barns, halls, or even under trees, were the stage where daily disputes unfolded. Attendance was often compulsory, for justice was woven into the very fabric of feudal obligation. I recall the faces of weary peasants summoned to answer for broken fences, unpaid dues, or small thefts. Their trials reflected the rhythms of rural life. The manorial court was presided over by the lord or his steward, who spoke with authority, backed by custom. Yet the community itself played a role, for neighbours gave testimony and juries of tenants confirmed decisions. The process was oral, shaped by memory rather than parchment. Each voice carried weight, but the shadow of the Lord's power loomed over all. To stand before such a court was to feel the closeness of both neighbourly scrutiny and seigneurial dominance. Most cases were petty, reflecting the simple struggles of peasant existence. A dispute over a strip of land, the trespassing of animals, or failure to perform labour services often filled the docket. Fines were the usual outcome, sometimes paid in coin, but often in goods or additional work. Rarely did the punishments reach cruelty. Instead, they served to reinforce the obligations that tied peasants to their lords. Justice was less about morality than about maintaining order in the fields. Still, even in their modest scope, these courts shaped lives profoundly. A peasant fined repeatedly could sink deeper into hardship, while another vindicated might preserve fragile dignity. The court was a mirror of communal life, recording tensions and bonds alike. I remember the hushed murmurs as verdicts were given, some eyes satisfied, others burning with quiet anger. These trials revealed the delicate balance between fairness and control. Custom was the lifeblood of these proceedings. What had been done before served as the guide for what must be done now. Elders recalled precedents, and their memories bound the community as firmly as any written code. In this way, tradition preserved stability, though it also froze inequalities in place. A serf could rarely expect justice equal to that of his lord's freeman, for law reflected the very structure of society. Attendance at these courts also bound peasants to their community. To witness was to share responsibility, to accept the outcomes even when disagreeable. The very act of gathering affirmed the authority of the manor, reminding all that justice was a shared burden. In these moments, I saw both solidarity and submission, neighbours united under the watchful eye of their lord. It was a form of justice both communal and hierarchical. On occasion, more serious crimes reached the manor court: theft, assault, or even accusations of witchcraft. Such cases often exceeded its authority and were sent upward to royal or ecclesiastical courts. Yet even then, the manor remained the first point of contact, the place where suspicion was voiced. It was the foundation of rural justice, shaping the first response before higher powers intervened. The manor court was both gatekeeper and guardian of local order. Looking back, I see these trials as the heartbeat of medieval justice. They lacked grandeur, yet they carried the weight of daily life. To face judgment in a manor court was to confront not only one's lord but one's neighbours, whose memories and voices shaped the outcome. In the soil-stained hands and weathered faces of peasants, justice was both lived and endured. It was the humble yet enduring frame upon which greater systems of law were built. When I think of women in the courts of the Middle Ages, I see both limitation and resilience. They stood as defendants, plaintiffs, and witnesses, yet their voices often carried less weight than those of men. The law reflected the structures of society, where women were bound to fathers, husbands, or sons. Still, their presence in trials cannot be overlooked, for they navigated a system that at once constrained and offered rare openings for assertion. Property disputes reveal much about their role. Widows, in particular, appeared in court to defend dower rights or to secure inheritance for their children. Some argued with skill, using the law to protect land and livelihood. I recall women who stood alone before judges, their heads covered in modest veils, yet their words steady, determined. Though their chances of success were uneven, they demonstrated that women were not absent from justice, but active participants when necessity pressed. In cases of morality, however, women bore heavier scrutiny. Accusations of adultery, fornication, or prostitution often drew harsher judgment for women than for men. Their reputations were fragile, easily shattered by whispers. Trials in such matters revealed the double standard of medieval society, where male transgression might be overlooked, but female misconduct carried lasting stain. I saw women tremble under questioning, their lives weighed against the measure of chastity demanded by both law and church. Witchcraft trials further exposed this imbalance. Women, particularly those on the margins, were far more likely to be accused. Their knowledge of herbs or midwifery, once valued, became grounds for suspicion. I remember the wary glances cast at such women, the ease with which misfortune was laid at their feet. To be female was, too often, to stand closer to accusation when storms struck or illness spread. Justice in these cases mirrored the fears of society more than its reason. Yet women were not only accused, they also sought justice. In urban courts, they brought suits against men for broken marriage contracts or violence. Some even stood as merchants, defending the terms of agreements. Their cases show how the law could serve as a shield, however frail. I recall reading of women who pressed claims persistently, refusing to be silenced. Though constrained, they demonstrated courage in demanding recognition before judges and peers. Testimony from women was often discounted, especially in serious trials, unless supported by men. Still, their words sometimes held decisive power, particularly in matters of childbirth, marriage, or domestic life, where they were recognized as authorities. In these narrow spaces, women's voices found respect. I once heard of midwives summoned to give crucial testimony about lineage and legitimacy, their knowledge shaping the fate of noble houses. Such moments remind me that even in silence, expertise endured. Punishments for women reflected gendered expectations. a man might be fined for quarrels, while a woman could be subjected to public humiliation in the cucking stool, paraded before neighbors in disgrace. These punishments reinforced control over women's bodies and reputations. Yet behind the spectacle lay deeper truths, that society feared the independence of women, seeking to keep them bound within visible limits. The court, in this sense, became an extension of household authority. In memory, I see women at once vulnerable and steadfast, pressed by a system that rarely favored them, yet finding paths within it. Their trials reveal the contradictions of medieval justice, harsh in its scrutiny, yet capable of offering tools for resistance. To face judgment as a woman was to walk a narrow path between silence and defiance, shaped by law, but also by courage. Their presence in court stands as a reminder that justice was never shaped by men alone, but by all who endured its gaze. Among the peculiarities of medieval justice was the privilege known as benefit of clergy. Clergymen accused of crimes could claim this right and be judged not by secular courts, but by ecclesiastical ones. I recall the murmurs in villages when a priest accused of theft or violence escaped the gallows by invoking his clerical status. It was a privilege resented by many, for the punishments of the church were often lighter, more penitential than brutal. Justice in such cases seemed cloaked in inequality. Originally, the benefit was limited to ordained clergy, but over time it widened. Literacy became the test, for the ability to read Latin was seen as proof of clerical status. I saw men accused of crimes asked to recite a verse from the Psalms, the so-called neck verse, for it could spare them from hanging. Those who could speak the words were passed to the church's courts, while those who could not were left to the harsher justice of kings and lords. In ecclesiastical courts, trials carried a different tone. Punishments sought correction rather than destruction. Fasting, pilgrimage, penance, or removal from office. Imprisonment was used, but executions were rare. The aim was to save the soul rather than simply to avenge the crime. I remember cases where priests guilty of grave offences were stripped of their robes, their shame public, but their lives spared. To many common folk, this leniency seemed proof that the church shielded its own. This privilege caused tension between crown and altar. Kings bristled at the sight of clerics escaping secular law, for it weakened royal authority. The quarrel between Henry II and Thomas Becket in England was fueled by this very issue. Henry demanded that clergy accused of serious crimes face royal justice, but Becket defended the church's right to try its own. Their conflict ended in blood at Canterbury, showing how deeply the matter struck at the balance of power. Benefit of clergy also fostered corruption. Some men exploited literacy to evade punishment, though they had no clerical duties. I once heard of repeat offenders who, after claiming the privilege once, were branded to prevent them from invoking it again. Still, the practice persisted, for the church's authority was too strong to be overturned entirely. It reminded all that justice was not uniform, but divided among institutions struggling for dominance. The people, however, saw the inequity clearly. A peasant caught stealing might lose his hand or his life, while a literate clerk walked free after reciting a verse. Such disparities bred resentment, fueling the belief that law bent to power rather than fairness. I felt the bitterness in villages where men whispered that God's law and man's law served different masters. Yet few dared to challenge it openly, for both king and church demanded obedience. Despite the controversy, benefit of clergy endured for centuries. It was part of a larger system in which secular and ecclesiastical jurisdictions overlapped, each jealous of its authority. To face trial as a cleric was to enter a world of milder sentences and spiritual remedies, while to face it as a peasant was to risk body and soul alike. The gap between the two was as wide as the gulf between altar and field. As I look back, I see in benefit of clergy both mercy and injustice. Mercy in that it spared many from cruelty, and injustice in that it denied equal treatment under the law. It was a reminder that medieval justice was shaped not only by crime and custom, but by status and station. To claim the church's protection was to walk in a different world, one where salvation was weighed more heavily than punishment. And so, justice was divided, as fractured as the age itself. One of the greatest changes I observed in the Middle Ages was the growing reliance on written records in trials. In earlier days, judgments lived in memory, fragile and shifting, but by the 12th century, parchment began to carry the voice of the law. Clerks sat with quills in hand, noting each accusation, each verdict, each fine imposed. The act of writing gave justice permanence, binding the present to the future. I can still hear the scratch of ink as judgments were set down, sealing fate in script. Royal courts led the way in this transformation. Rolls of proceedings were kept, listing the names of litigants, the charges, and the outcomes. These documents allowed kings to assert continuity, ensuring that past rulings could be recalled to strengthen future ones. I recall seeing a steward unfurl a long roll of parchment, names written like a chain linking generations. The written word gave authority that no fading memory could rival. Ecclesiastical courts perfected this practice even further. Their registries included testimonies, confessions, and appeals, preserved with meticulous care. Scholars and bishops could consult these archives, drawing on past cases to guide present decisions. This discipline of record-keeping lent their trials a gravity unmatched by oral systems. To step into such a court was to feel the weight of centuries pressing down, every word echoing those recorded before. The preservation of documents also allowed for appeals. A man dissatisfied with judgment could request his case be examined at a higher court. The records carried upward as proof of proceedings. Without writing, such appeals would have been impossible. I remember how the sight of a sealed document comforted some, for it meant their words would not vanish into silence. Others feared it, knowing their shame or guilt was preserved for eternity. Charters and registers extended beyond trials to land disputes and contracts. Written proof became increasingly valued, displacing oral testimony. A deed sealed in wax could settle quarrels that once required oaths and witnesses. I saw peasants marvel at these parchments, their marks and symbols alien yet decisive. The written page grew into a new kind of authority, less personal but more enduring. Trust shifted from memory to ink. This shift changed the very nature of justice. Proceedings became less about the moment and more about the record, less about communal agreement and more about procedural accuracy. Lawyers and clerks gained power, for they understood the language of documents. Justice became a matter of archives, where the past could be summoned to bear upon the present. It was a colder system, yet one that promised consistency across years and lands. Still, reliance on records did not erase inequality. The poor rarely had access to charters or documents, relying instead on fragile testimony. Literacy itself became a shield and a sword, favoring those who could wield it. The growth of records deepened the gulf between learned and unlearned, between ruler and subject. I saw how this widened distrust, for many feared that ink, like power, could be twisted to favor the mighty. Yet in the long memory of time, these documents preserved more than verdicts. They preserved the very soul of the age. To read them now is to hear the voices of peasants, nobles, and clergy alike, carried across centuries by parchment. In them, sorrow, anger, and hope endure. Trials ceased to be fleeting moments and became part of history itself. The quill ensured that justice, however imperfect, would not be forgotten. In medieval courts, a verdict was not always the final word. Though many peasants believed the Lord's judgment unshakable, the possibility of appeal created cracks in this certainty. If a litigant felt wronged, he could petition a higher authority, often invoking royal or ecclesiastical power. The act itself carried risk, for it challenged the honor of the original judge. Yet for some, it was the only hope of escaping a sentence that seemed unjust. Royal justice became the beacon for those who distrusted local courts. Kings positioned themselves as the ultimate arbiters, ready to hear grievances that lesser lords had mishandled. By travelling circuits or holding sessions in great halls, monarchs reinforced the notion that justice flowed from their crown. The image of a petitioner kneeling before a king with parchment in hand was more than symbolic. It was a reminder that sovereignty promised protection. The Church offered an equally powerful path of appeal. Papal courts in Rome and episcopal seats across Europe received petitions from the aggrieved. Clerics trained in canon law examined records with precision, sometimes overturning local judgments. The authority of these spiritual courts extended even into secular disputes, especially where morality or marriage was concerned. Many saw this avenue as divine intervention, a higher justice rooted in the sacred. One famous case illustrates this reach. Disputes over ecclesiastical property often moved beyond local bishops to Rome itself. Years could pass while letters and envoys travelled across Christendom, but the weight of a papal decision could silence even kings. The slow process frustrated some, but it revealed the layered system where appeals bound villages to vast institutions. Justice was no longer confined to local soil. It stretched across continents. Not all had the means to pursue appeal. Wealth and influence often determined whether a case reached higher courts. The costs of travel, scribes, and representation excluded the poor, leaving them trapped within local judgments. Yet even their awareness of appeals shaped the perception of justice. Rumours of cases overturned far away fostered a sense of possibility. However faint, that power could be checked. The system of appeals introduced a new form of accountability. Judges knew their decisions might be scrutinized by more powerful eyes, forcing greater care in their verdicts. Written records became essential, ensuring higher authorities could review proceedings. This added pressure did not eliminate corruption, but it curbed the boldest abuses. In the shadow of appeal, justice grew more cautious and deliberate. At times, appeals were acts of defiance, weapons in broader conflicts between rulers. Lords and monarchs contested their authority by siding with or against petitioners. A peasant's case could become the spark in a feud between noble families or crown and church. Thus, appeals were not only about righting wrongs, but also about shifting the balance of power. Each petition carried echoes beyond the individual. In the end, appeals represented the struggle for justice in its purest form, the refusal to accept a single voice as absolute. They embodied the human desire to seek a higher ear, whether king, pope, or God. Though the road was costly and uncertain, it revealed a truth still alive today, that people yearn for justice beyond the reach of flawed men, justice that carries the weight of eternity. Medieval justice was not only handed down by kings, lords, or bishops. It was often rooted in the everyday life of villages. Communities played a decisive role in shaping outcomes, since trials could not proceed without the presence of neighbours who served as witnesses or jurors. Their words carried immense weight, for they knew the character, history, and reputation of the accused. This closeness blurred the line between law and daily life. Collective responsibility defined much of the judicial process. If a theft occurred in one hamlet, the entire community could be fined until the culprit was revealed. This pressure bound neighbours together, pushing them to police their own members. Gossip, suspicions, and alliances shaped the search for truth. Justice in such settings was not distant, but embedded in the fabric of local relations, both protective and oppressive. Trials by jury emerged in this communal context. Instead of impartial strangers, medieval jurors were men of the same village or manor, chosen precisely because they were familiar with the case. Their verdict reflected not only evidence, but also personal knowledge and shared memory. This closeness could provide fairness, but it could also spark bias, as long-standing feuds or friendships influenced decisions. Oaths formed another cornerstone of local justice. Swearing before God and one's neighbours was considered binding, and a man's reputation could determine how many oath helpers he needed. A respected villager might need only one or two supporters, while a distrusted individual might be required to gather many. The process relied heavily on community perception, elevating honor as a form of proof. Village assemblies often doubled as courts. Local gatherings heard disputes over land boundaries, inheritance, or broken contracts. The decisions reached in these open spaces reflected not only law, but also the shared values of the group. In this way, justice was a communal performance, where the weight of consensus carried as much force as written codes. People accepted the verdicts because they arose from familiar voices. Festivals and markets also became stages for enforcing justice. Sentences were sometimes announced publicly in squares, ensuring that everyone saw the outcome. The shame or honor attached to a ruling spread quickly through these gatherings. In small communities, reputation was inescapable, and the social consequences of a judgment could be harsher than the legal penalty itself. Women and the poor often had limited voices in these processes, yet their presence was felt indirectly. A whispered comment, a recalled incident, or a shared memory could sway collective judgment. Justice in local communities was porous, influenced by countless informal interactions. The formal court and the informal life of the village blended together in ways that shaped both fairness and prejudice. Ultimately, the role of communities in justice demonstrated the medieval belief that law was not a distant abstraction, but a living agreement among people. Villagers carried the responsibility of truth on their shoulders, binding themselves to the outcome. Justice was not merely imposed from above. It was enacted in the very heart of daily life, where reputation, honor, and faith wove together to determine a person's fate. Justice in the Middle Ages was rarely hidden behind closed doors. It was staged in the open, where punishment became a spectacle. Authorities understood that public suffering carried a message stronger than private confinement. Executions, mutilations, and floggings were arranged in central squares or near churches, where the greatest number of people could watch. Fear was the intended lesson, ensuring that the crime of one became the warning for many. The rituals surrounding punishment carried theatrical elements. Executioners dressed in distinctive attire. Drums or bells announced the moment, and crowds gathered with anticipation. It was not merely about ending a life or inflicting pain, but about reaffirming authority before the eyes of the people. The presence of officials, clergy, and sometimes even musicians turned justice into performance, reinforcing order through spectacle. The gallows and pillory became symbols of control etched into the collective imagination. A criminal tied to the pillory endured not only physical restraint, but also humiliation as neighbors mocked or threw refuse. These punishments worked on both the body and the reputation, stripping away dignity in front of familiar faces. The enduring shame often lingered longer than wounds, reshaping how one moved within the community. Executions, especially for serious crimes, took on an almost ritualistic quality. Beheadings, hangings, or burnings at the stake followed precise sequences meant to underline divine justice. Priests were present to extract last confessions. Prayers were recited, and the condemned might address the crowd in final words. These ceremonies framed punishment as not just human retribution, but also as alignment with God's will. Spectators were active participants. They jeered, prayed, or in some cases pleaded for mercy, their reactions shaping the atmosphere. A silent crowd could unsettle the authorities, while an enthusiastic one amplified their power. Public punishments thus became moments where ruler and ruled engaged in an unspoken dialogue, with pain as the language and obedience as the desired response. Markets and feast days often coincided with such events, ensuring larger audiences. For rulers, this timing was strategic. The more people witnessed justice, the stronger the impression. These moments blurred entertainment and authority, as people brought their families to watch what was both terrifying and captivating. Power relied not only on force, but also on its ability to be seen. The theatre of punishment extended beyond the condemned. Executioners themselves were figures of fascination and dread, both despised and necessary. Their work maintained the rhythm of fear that kept communities in line. The stage of justice was incomplete without them, and their presence embodied the raw edge of authority that rulers preferred not to touch directly. By turning punishment into spectacle, medieval society ensured that law was etched into memory, not by parchment, but by sight and sound. The cries of the condemned, the clash of instruments, and the silence after death left impressions no decree could match. Power was not only exercised, it was displayed, dramatized, and imprinted onto the minds of all who watched. History preserved certain trials not only because of their outcomes, but because of the way they captured the anxieties of their age. Some cases became symbols of injustice, others of divine justice fulfilled, and still others of raw political power. These trials were remembered long after the verdicts because they revealed the fragility of human rights under the weight of authority and belief. Each one serves as a window into the medieval soul. The trial of Joan of Arc in 1431 remains one of the most infamous. A peasant girl who claimed divine visions, she led French troops to victories that shifted the tide of war. Captured by the Burgundians and handed to the English, she was accused of heresy and cross-dressing. The proceedings were riddled with political motives disguised as religious scrutiny. Burned at the stake, her trial later stood as a glaring example of power disguised as piety. The Knights Templar faced another legendary trial in the early 14th century. Once powerful defenders of Christendom, they were accused of blasphemy, heresy, and corruption. Under torture, many confessed to crimes they never committed. The order was dissolved, its leaders executed, and its wealth seized by monarchs eager for treasure. The trial revealed how greed and fear could dismantle even the most revered institutions. In England, the case of Thomas Becket's murder in 1170 also carried echoes of trial, though posthumous. The Archbishop of Canterbury, slain by knights who believed they acted under King Henry II's will, became a martyr. Though Becket himself never stood accused, the investigation into his death turned the spotlight on royal authority. The Church used the incident to reaffirm its power against kings, shaping the delicate balance of medieval politics. Accusations of witchcraft also shaped some of the most harrowing medieval trials. Though the witch-hunting craze would reach its peak later, isolated cases appeared earlier, often targeting vulnerable women. Confessions extracted through pain painted vivid pictures of Sabbaths and pacts with the devil. These trials reflected the growing fear of hidden enemies within communities, laying the groundwork for centuries of superstition-driven persecution. Political intrigue made trials weapons in dynastic struggles. In France, the affair of the Tour de Nesle in 1314 saw the daughters-in-law of King Philip IV accused of adultery. Their alleged lovers were brutally executed, while the women endured imprisonment. The scandal destabilized royal succession and tarnished the crown's image. Here, justice became less about truth and more about consolidating political legitimacy. Even animals were dragged into the medieval court. Pigs, rats, and insects were occasionally put on trial, accused of damaging crops or causing death. These strange spectacles, though almost absurd to modernize, reflected the belief that divine justice encompassed all creation. Trials of animals emphasized the medieval conviction that order must extend to every corner of existence, no matter how improbable. The legacy of these notorious trials is not merely their judgments, but the way they reveal a society shaped by fear, faith, and authority. Whether through the execution of visionaries, the dismantling of powerful orders, or the condemnation of innocents, the courtroom became a stage where the values of the time played out in full. They remind us that justice was as much about spectacle and control as it was about truth. The closing centuries of the Middle Ages witnessed profound changes in the way societies approached law and order. The feudal model of fragmented authority slowly gave way to centralized power in the hands of monarchs and emerging nation-states. This consolidation meant that justice became less tied to local custom and more aligned with uniform codes. It marked the beginning of a system where law served the state as much as the community. Universities played an essential role in shaping new judicial frameworks. With the revival of Roman law, especially through the study of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, legal scholars began to introduce more structured principles into European courts. These ideas emphasized rational procedure over ordeal or spectacle. The influence of trained jurists ensured that justice increasingly rested on argumentation rather than superstition. The decline of trial by ordeal was one of the most symbolic shifts. By the 13th century, the Church had distanced itself from such practices, discouraging rituals that tested guilt through fire or water. Instead, emphasis turned toward written evidence, witness testimony, and confession. The gradual disappearance of ordeals signaled a broader movement toward procedures that valued logic over ritualized fate. Rising bureaucracies supported these transformations. Kings established more permanent courts staffed by professionals rather than part-time officials. The use of clerks, records, and written verdicts created a paper trail that enhanced consistency. This professionalization distinguished early modern justice from the ad hoc decisions of medieval assemblies, grounding law in systems rather than personalities. Torture, however, remained a troubling constant during the transition. Though meant to extract truth, it reflected the persistent medieval belief in physical suffering as a gateway to revelation. Yet even here, shifts occurred, with jurists attempting to regulate its use and confine it to specific circumstances. The tension between brutality and emerging rationalism marked this uneasy period of change. Religious upheaval also shaped the evolution of justice. The Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation gave birth to new inquisitorial courts, determined to enforce orthodoxy with systematic efficiency. While these courts intensified surveillance of belief, they also introduced standardized procedures that reflected the growing power of centralized authority. Faith and law intertwined in ways that redefined both. Economic change brought by trade and urbanization required new legal responses. Commercial contracts, property disputes, and maritime law pushed courts to adapt beyond feudal obligations. The rise of merchant courts and codified commercial regulations mirrored a Europe moving toward complexity. Law began to serve not only kings and churches, but also the dynamic forces of economy and expansion. By the dawn of the early modern era, justice no longer resembled the patchwork of medieval customs and rituals. Though echoes of the past lingered, especially in punishments and public displays, the trajectory pointed toward rational codes, centralized courts, and professional judges. The journey from ordeal to reason, from village assembly to royal bench, laid the foundation for the systems that continue to shape the modern world. The echoes of medieval trials still resonate in today's legal systems. Though the methods may have changed, the foundational concepts of justice, authority, and order established in the Middle Ages laid groundwork for what followed. Courts became spaces where truth was pursued through ritual, procedure, and judgment, leaving behind a cultural memory of law as a public force. The very notion that disputes must be resolved by formal process rather than unchecked violence remains one of the enduring inheritances. One significant legacy is the emphasis on community participation. Medieval juries, though different from their modern counterparts, fostered the idea that ordinary people could help determine guilt or innocence. This principle of lay involvement survived, evolving into the trial by jury system in many countries. The medieval precedent instilled the belief that justice could not be entrusted solely to rulers or clerics, but required the voice of the people. The spectacle of justice also left a deep mark. Public punishments, though eventually abandoned, underscored the role of law as a visible performance of authority. Even now, modern states understand the symbolic power of trials, which often extend beyond the courtroom to shape public opinion. Medieval rulers recognized early on that law was not only about punishment, but also about legitimacy and control. Written record keeping, developed in the later Middle Ages, represents another vital contribution. Registers of verdicts, testimonies, and judgments transformed justice into a system that could be studied, appealed, and improved over time. Today's reliance on documents, precedents, and codified statutes owes much to these early experiments in bureaucracy. What began as fragile parchment archives evolved into the backbone of modern jurisprudence. Religion's influence during the medieval era also lingers in subtle ways. Trials shaped by Christian morality reinforced the idea that justice carried not just legal, but also ethical dimensions. While secularization has removed overt theology from many systems, the moral undertone, that law must embody notions of right and wrong, remains deeply embedded. Medieval courts taught Europe to see justice as more than rules. It was also a reflection of conscience. The harshness of punishments, though largely discarded, left lessons of their own. Societies eventually recoiled from the severity of executions and tortures, leading to reforms inspired by Enlightenment thinkers. In this way, medieval extremes served as warnings for future generations. The memory of suffering produced by unchecked cruelty helped shape the pursuit of more humane systems. Internationally, the medieval experience influenced colonial and global law. As European powers expanded, they carried with them legal traditions rooted in medieval precedent. From trial procedures to concepts of property and sovereignty, echoes of that world spread far beyond Europe. The medieval court became a seed planted in distant lands, adapting to new contexts, but carrying the imprint of its origins. Ultimately, the lasting legacy of medieval trials lies in their paradoxical nature. They were brutal, yet formative, flawed, yet foundational. By wrestling with guilt, punishment, and community responsibility, medieval societies created pathways that led to modern justice. Their struggles remind us that law evolves not in perfection, but in the tension between past and future, where every judgment leaves an imprint on history.